Well, we're back to Ezra today. Oh, again. Oh, this is really exciting today. Really exciting. But I thought I'd start with this because this is one of the most exciting pictures I've got on my computer. And it actually ties in. It ties in today with what's going on. This was tied across the entry to an Egyptian tomb. And it was tied in 1323 BC. What you're seeing right there was tied 13 centuries before Jesus. It was tied for 3 centuries before David was king of Israel. And even more centuries until we get to the time of Ezra. By the time of Jesus, it looked exactly like this. And it was discovered, this tomb was discovered because it was in a funny place in Egypt. It was discovered and found out it was almost fully intact. And it was in 1922. So this picture was taken in 1922. You know whose tomb this is? Probably the only one you know, King Tut. So this is the entry to King Tut's tomb. And that piece of rope had been there since 1300 BC. And a lot of people say, how can a piece of hemp rope stay good like that for that many centuries? Well, you know how dry the desert is in Egypt, and it was actually cut off from air. The oxygen level was very low in the room. So it's been like that. I think it's just fascinating to see something that has survived that long and looks exactly like it did the day they tied it in 1300 BC. It's an amazing thing. Now, what I want to show you on this is that on the far right on that picture, there's a glob of clay. It's a seal, right? That thing, I'll show it red right here. It's a seal. It's a glob of clay they put on the end. So basically, although the rope wouldn't mechanically stop you from getting into the tomb, what it does is it says if you break this rope, then you're going to suffer the consequences of the authority that's imprinted on the seal. Okay, and if you do a close-up of the seal, it looks kind of like this. Not a great picture, but if you use your imagination a little bit, there's actually a picture of an Anubis, you know, the dog-headed person, stuff like it is there. And this oval right here is actually from a signet ring. So they did the rope across this, but the signet ring to say, by my authority, if you break this seal, which you could do if you got a pocket knife, you can break the seal. But if you break this seal, you suffer the consequences of the supreme authority of who put their signet ring on this piece of clay. So that's what seals did during the day. They were a warning saying if you violate this, you're violating the very authority of the person who said, this is closed, it will forever be closed, and if you open this, you suffer the consequences of my authority. Now, of course, the person who made that seal is no longer alive. So what are they going to do about it? Of course, at the time in Egypt, the pharaohs thought that they were gods. So it was sort of like, and this is where the curse of the pharaohs comes from so many science fiction movies, you know, the Mummy and stuff like that. Oh, there's a curse there. Actually, there's no curse on this seal. This is just a royal seal saying, according to my authority, don't go in here. You cannot go in here. You cannot go in here. And this is a very common theme. This has happened in ancient times all the time. We'll see it a little bit today. I ran across it myself personally when I was in Israel years ago. There's a part of the Wailing Wall, the wall where the Jews go and they worship, because it's pretty much the only remaining stones that are connected to the original temple. That was the second temple, which today we're going to look at that very same temple. Down there by that area, there's a place that, only men can go. It's kind of a funny thing, but it's kind of like a study area for Orthodox Jews inside. And I knew that study area, it's underground. It's in a big stone rooms and stuff like that. And it's right against the Wailing Wall, but underground. If you go to the very end of it, like you're heading toward into the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, I knew there was another door at the end of it inside that had tunnels that went in funny places. A friend of mine had actually done some archaeology there. He says, it's there. So if you're there in that big room that's got all those books, got all those Orthodox Jews that are studying, go to the very end of that underground room and you'll find a door. Go in that door. So I thought last time I was there, that's what I'm going to do. So I went in that room. It's full of Orthodox Jews with the woolly hats and stuff like that. Lots of books on the sides. It's like a study center for Orthodox Jews. I went to the very back of that room. I was going very underground in Jerusalem, and there was the door. So I approached the door, and then I realized I can't open the door. And you know why? Because there's a rabbi's hat hung on the doorknob, which means don't touch this doorknob. It wasn't just hanging a hat. It was a sign of authority. Now, I could have just taken the hat and go, wow, whatever, I'm going in here. But it's a symbol of authority that says, do not enter. And this rabbi's hat said, you violate my authority if you go through this door. Just like Pharaoh said, you violate my authority if you break this seal. And today we'll see how seals work in terms of communicating the authority of a distant source and how that works. Okay, so you'll have to watch for it. So where are we today? Well, we're going through Ezra and Nehemiah, and it covers about 100 years, the last 100 narrative years of Israel before Jesus comes. And 538 is where we started. It's a significant date because that's when the king of Persia, Cyrus, said to all the Jews who were slaves in Persia, you can go home and you can rebuild the temple. And not only can you rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, I'm going to give you cash to rebuild the temple. And we're going to give you back all the gold and silver implements that were in the temple when Nebuchadnezzar came in and knocked the place down and destroyed the temple. Go back and rebuild the temple. That was in 538. Now we've actually pressed a little bit into Ezra, and we're not at 538, but we're presently at a magic number, 516 BC. And you'll see why that's a magic number in a second. That's a magic year, 516, and that's where we are in the narrative. Keep that in mind because that's important. We're going to do math later on. You mean math with years? Yes, you can do this. So trust me. So here we are. What happened, let me just go back before we see that. Let me show you. At 516, we're stuck in terms of rebuilding the temple. It turns out that they've gone through a series of kings of Persia, starting with Cyrus, who was very, very supportive and let 40,000 people go back to Israel in order to build the temple. Cyrus is very supportive, but of course Cyrus died, and the next king of Persia was Artaxerxes, whose other name is Ahasuerus. I love saying that, but I get messy. He was kind of against it. Some of the local people ratted on the Jews who were rebuilding the temple, even though they had permission from Cyrus. Artaxerxes says nope, and so he put a stop order on it. We got to the end of that stop order, and suddenly the prophets that were there at the time, Haggai and Zechariah, whose prophecies we have in the Old Testament, they were led by the Lord to say, oh, we don't care what Artaxerxes says. God says, keep building. So they kept building again. Well, then some other bad guys showed up because Artaxerxes died, and Darius comes to the throne. With that change, then the people in Israel who are against the building of the temple decide again, by whose authority have you restarted building? They restarted building against Artaxerxes because God said so through the prophets. So they rebuilt. They're rebuilding, and then these bad guys say, look, we're going to tattle to King Darius, the new king. He's only been on the throne for a year, and we're going to tell him that you guys are building the temple. Well, the Jews say to those guys, well, this is what Cyrus said we could do. If you go back and you check in the records, you'll see that Cyrus said we could do this. This is now 20 years ago. And so go check and see. They say, well, we are going to do exactly that. We are going to write a letter to Darius, and we're going to say, these people say they have permission from the king of Persia. And we're not sure he does or not, but you better check your archives and see if that's okay. But we're going to let them keep building until we hear back from you, King Darius. So check the records, see if maybe they're lying to us. Right? And then we'll put a stop to this. But they let them keep building while this letter went off back to the center of the Medo-Persian Empire, back to King Darius, for King Darius to check the records. So he checks the records, and that's where we are today. Okay, we're in chapter 6, verse 1. Darius, now he's the king of Persia. He's like a Mede. He's a Medo-Persian kind of dude. Darius, the king, made a decree. And a search was made in Babylonia in the house of the archives where the documents were stored. And in Ecbatana, which, by the way, is the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. In fact, today, if you type on Google that name, Ecbatana, you'll find an archaeological dig going on today in a place called Hamdan or Hamran. I forget what it's called. I think it's Hamran. Okay. So in Ecbatana, the citadel, that is the province of Media, a scroll was found through all the scrolls. And in that scroll, they read the scroll because this is what the Jews said, check your records, man, check your records, on which was written this. So now we have an actual copy of what was on this scroll that had been archived in Ecbatana, all the proclamations made from the kings, including Cyrus and Artaxerxes and even early Darius. So here's what they found. This is what it says, a record. In the first year of Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt and the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits, its breadth 60 cubits. By the way, a cubit is about this long. It's this long. It's a foot and a half. It's a foot and a half. So you go 1.5 times 90, times 60 is 90. So it's 90 feet this way, 90 feet this way. It's a big structure. And it's going to have, verse 4, 3 layers of great stones, 1 layer of timber. The timber is usually the roof because stones don't bridge a roof really well. Right, David? Okay, just asking. We have an expert in the room. Okay, so you have timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. Let the cost be paid by the royal treasury. That is the royal treasury of the Medo-Persian Empire is paying for this. Okay, we remember this because we read this a while back, several chapters back. But he recorded that. And also, let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple that is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and you shall put them in the house of God. Excellent. This actually matches the history we read in Ezra already. That's exactly what he said, and thank God that Cyrus wrote it down on a piece of paper, because now 20 years hence, they're searching the archives and they actually find the real thing that Cyrus said. Okay, so what do? Well, now from the royal house, they write a response back to the people in the area of Israel, the land beyond the river. And so this is what they send back. This is the letter they send back. Now, therefore, Tattenai, who is the governor of the province beyond the river, the province beyond the river is what they called the area of Israel. Beyond the river Euphrates, actually. Okay, he's sending this to Tattenai, the governor there, Shethar-Bozenai, and your associates, the governors who are in the province beyond the river. So that's the 2. This is King Darius 2, these guys. And his message is, keep away. What? Keep away. He's telling them on the basis of what Cyrus had said, his predecessor's predecessor 20 years ago. He's saying, keep away from these people. Verse 7, let the work on this house of God alone. Let them alone. Don't do anything with these people. But instead of just saying, don't get in their way, he goes beyond this because there was more support in Cyrus's letter. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. And moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. So he's not just saying keep away and get out of their way. He's saying, and you've got something you've got to do to support them. Because remember, in Cyrus's letter they dug up from 20 years ago, there was a supportive thing coming from Cyrus. He says, you've got to support this financially out of the money of the kingdom. Okay, so here's what he tells them to do. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province from beyond the river, and whatever is needed, bulls, rams, or sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, you need to provide these things as the priests at Jerusalem require. Let that be given to them day by day without fail. Now remember, when the Jews came back to this area, the place was just desolate. I mean, the temple had been knocked down. A lot of structures had been knocked down. A lot of homeless people hanging out in Israel. I mean, the place was a wreck. And so when these people came back from Persia, now it's been 20 years, but reestablishing. Can you imagine going to a house somewhere in the middle of nowhere that's been knocked down? You have to not only rebuild the house, you have to replant fields. I mean, it's hard to live. So the King Cyrus said, give them whatever they need to live. And Darius doubles up and says, yeah, give them whatever they need to live, including sacrifices for this temple. And without fail. Why? That they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Okay, there's a little dig in there for Darius. Yeah, make sure they get this done and remind them to pray for me and my boys. That's what he's saying right there. There's nothing wrong with that because he's actually helping in this process. Verse 11, his letter goes on. Also, I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, and I can see Darius thinking, oh, let's see, what sounds bad? You know, if you go against this edict, I know what I'll say. Here's what I'm going to say. A beam shall be pulled out of his house and he shall be impaled on it. Oh, that's pleasant. So don't go against what Darius has said, or else we're going to pull a pole out of your house, we're going to sharpen the end of it, and we're going to stick you on it. Now, that's not an idle threat. This was something that was actually quite well known in the Medo-Persian Empire, and before them with the Assyrians, where you take your enemies and you stick them on a pole. It's like the predecessor of being on the cross, but it's much, much worse. Much worse. So that's his threat. You do what I say here, or else we're going to take your house apart, take a pole out of it that supports your roof, and we're going to impale you on it. That's what we're going to do. And then I see Darius sitting and thinking, we need to do one more thing. What's scary? Oh, okay, here's another scary thing. And his house shall be made a dunghill. Yeah, there you go. So not only going to pull a pole out of the roof, and the house is going to collapse, but then everyone who has, dung is going to come over and it's going to put it on your house. There. Yeah, enjoy that. So Darius, to speak the obvious, Darius is quite forceful about the fact that you do not go against this order. You do not go against this order. And he has to make it powerful like this because I'm sure for the people that are there, they're just gobsmacked by what it says. Not only do we have to keep away from these people who are rebuilding the temple, but we have to pay for it out of the treasury here. What? And if they're going to do sacrifices in the finished temple, we have to provide the animals for it? Yes. Well, I don't think so. Pole, impaled, dunghill. So they go along. They have to go along with it. May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this or to destroy this house of God that is in Jerusalem. Now Darius is actually invoking the God of Israel. He's saying, not only are you going to have to worry about me impaling you on one of your roof poles and putting manure on your house, now you're going to have to deal with the God of Israel himself. May he engage and overthrow anyone who's against this. Darius is very pro-Jew right here. I mean, he wants to see this happen. And part of it is because he's respecting what Cyrus had said 20 years prior. And Cyrus was clearly directed by God. I mean, he took the initiative to actually free the Jews from his own nation who were their slaves and send them back home for the specific purpose of building the temple. Cyrus. Artaxerxes not quite as good. But then Darius back again. So Darius is saying basically what his predecessor had said. Let them alone, let them build this temple, and watch out for their God. Wow. I, Darius, make a decree, let it be done with all diligence. Darius, happy face. Well, by the way, they never did sign their proclamations. Many times if you go to a bank or something, you have to prove who you are. You sign your name and your signature is supposedly unique enough to identify who you are. These guys never relied on signatures to prove who they were. And this is where the seals come in. Because after this, instead of signing this, what he would do is just put a seal on it like that. And that seal had his specific emblem of his kingdom that could not be, couldn't be copied. And so that wouldn't be put on there. And so this letter would be rolled up. The seal would be on there. It would have the specific things about his royal house on it. And that would be the way of saying this really, really did come from Darius. Because look, there's his seal. And by the way, too, like on King Tut's tomb, that seal means we better do what's inside this. Or else you're going against the power of the superpower of the age, the Medo-Persian Empire. That's what that seal means. You can break that seal anytime, but that's what the seal means. It's kind of a token to tell you about the authority that's behind this. And it should be sobering. Now, we don't know in the account that there was a seal, but no one sends a message like this from 1,000 miles away without some kind of authenticating seal. So I'm sure, everyone's sure it was on there. So that's the official response. So what's the response from the people who are anti-Jews at the time? 13. Well, according to the word sent by Darius the king, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-bozenai and their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered. Yes, sir, we will do that. Okay. And that's what they do. It's a smart move. 14. And the elders of the Jews, well, they built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. So they were already still building. They were waiting to see if Darius was going to stop the building. But Haggai and Zechariah both were quite convinced of the fact that God had said, continue building until you get done. In a sense, it doesn't matter what Darius says. And last time we were together in here, we looked at some of the things that Haggai and Zechariah said. Haggai, we don't have as much on this, but it's there. It's exactly what was said then. Zechariah so much more, because Zechariah, as he's speaking for God, not only addresses this moment in time in 5:16, this moment in time, but somehow he steps back and actually addresses the entire span of the Bible as it pertains to the Jews. And in fact, Zechariah not only talks about this present thing, about, build the temple, but he looks forward in time, and he tells us about Jesus' coming into Jerusalem on a donkey. And he talks about the very end of time, where there'll be great wars because the world will battle against. So Zechariah he comes back and he sees not only this moment in 5:16, but he sees everything that's going to happen in the future. And he includes that in his prophecies. And everyone's head is kind of spinning around. That's the context of it. We saw that. So they're blessed and they prosper because they listen to what God says through his prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. And then he goes on. They finished their building by decree of the God of Israel. Yeah. Well, wait, I thought it was the decree of Darius. No, the decree of God of Israel. And that came through Haggai and Zechariah. They finished it according to the decree of the God of Israel. But we'll give minor credit to there's Cyrus and there's Darius and there's Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. But I like how he says it. He says, it was finished according to the decree of the God of Israel. And that's the important thing. That's the important thing. Cyrus was on board. He's the one that gave them their freedom from being slaves in Persia. Cyrus is on board and started the whole process. But it's out of chronological order. Artaxerxes was next. But Darius is a close second in terms of being, a partner with God in this. That's why he has him there. Cyrus number 1, Darius number 2, Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. So that's how it goes. But I like how he says that. Finish the building by decree of the God of Israel. And, oh, by the way, God used Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. Okay. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. Woo! Hey, we've been waiting for this, and you're not excited. Thank you. That was very insincere. We should have handed out noisemakers or something like that. But this is 22 years. 22 years after they left Persia. It took them this long. And that's not an uncommon time to build a temple and stuff like that. But they've rebuilt the entire thing. And by the way, the structure that they just now finished is the same structure that Jesus will visit in the 1st century, 5 centuries later. It's the same one, very same one. And it will stand like this until Rome comes in 70 AD and knocks it down again. But it's that same temple. That same temple. It's important to see that it's the month of Adar. Adar, that's the Jewish calendar. Adar is the 12th and last month in the Jewish calendar. And that's important. You'll see in a second why that's a big deal. But we have in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king, because of extra biblical historical stuff, we know that the 6th year of Darius is 516. We know it very accurately. And by the way, 516 is also interesting because remember when Nebuchadnezzar came in and he invaded the southern kingdom, he trashed the temple back then and he took away all these captives, including Daniel and his friends. Remember that? So there's this thing that came in when Nebuchadnezzar did that. The year of that was 586. We know that very clearly as well. So if you take 586 when the temple was put down, and 516, when it's rebuilt, and you subtract 586 and 516, you get 70 years. And that's what Jeremiah said. You would be in exile for 7 years. It's exactly 70 years between the destruction of the temple and the rebuilding of the temple. Whoa, that's cool. Okay, that was just... And Daniel had figured that out in Daniel 9. Okay. And the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites and the rest of the returned exiles, they celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. And if you know anything about the celebration of the creation of the temples, and Solomon's is the only other temple before this that had a celebration. Go compare that. It's in 2 Samuel. It's really quite astonishing. But he wanted to talk about how big the dedication was. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs. It's a lot of animals. A lot of animals. And plus, as a sin offering for all of Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. Now, that last 12 goats is not just on the side. I mean, it seems like, well, that's nothing compared to that many bulls. Yeah, but there's if you know your Levitical law, you know that there was a time in which in the ceremonies in Jerusalem with the temple, they would place the sins of the people on a goat. 2 goats, actually. You can go back and look at that. So this is an important statement at the end about the fact that what they did, the goats, the special interest, the goats are a symbol of the fact here that they've come to the end of their sinful stiff-arming toward God, their rebellion, and they've taken that sin, they've placed it on these goats, and it's been taken away from the nation. So it really is it's a statement of the normalization of the relationship of the people of Israel, who had been rebellious, with the God who loves them. And that sin's taken away. Wow, big deal. 18. And now that we have a temple, they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their divisions for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it's written in the book of Moses. So if you look back in Exodus and more, you see where when the temple came into being, actually when the tabernacle came into being, which was the tent version of the temple, the Levites, the sons of Levi, were the ones who were tasked with taking care of the temple. And they had specific jobs. And they haven't had those jobs all these years that the temple hasn't been there. So what he's saying is that now that we have the temple, let's get squared away what the sons of Aaron do. They're Levites, the rest of the Levites. We get squared away. Now we can run the temple. Now we can do this in service of God. We're up and running now in the 12th month of the year, Adar, and that's important. I wonder what the next celebration is going to be, because we can do that at the temple now for the first time in 2 generations. This is a big deal. Well, they did Passover. Because if you know your Jewish calendar, Passover is in the first month of the Jewish calendar. Adar is the last month. So it was just a month away. It was about 5 weeks later, Passover showed up. And they said, hot dog, what we can do, we can celebrate Passover, which we haven't been able to do for 2 whole generations. And we're going to do it right. We got the Levites in place. We got the sons of Aaron in place. We're going to do Passover, and we're going to do Passover right. What a great day this is. So on the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. By the way, I put Leviticus 23 in there because that's exactly the right day. That's the day that was specified. Some people have asked, how is it they remember what day of the week it is since they just came out of captivity from Persia? I mean, was anyone keeping a calendar like someone who goes in prison, puts little chalk marks on the wall? I mean, how do they know what day it was? Well, fortunately, the Jewish calendar is built on new moons. And new moons are very easy to determine in the night sky. Very easy. And you can get a rough idea what season you're in. So they can have the day down perfect because of the new moon sequence. So that's how they did it. They didn't have to put chalk marks on the wall while they were slaves in Persia. They just watched the moon, they can tell. So the 14th day of the first month, which is Nisan, the returned exiles kept the Passover. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves, had gotten ready. They'd gotten ready, purified themselves together. All of them were clean. Let's do Passover. So they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests, and for themselves. I put a picture there because the slaughtering of such an innocent animal, and I mentioned this earlier, is emotionally troubling for most people. I mean, it's like, why something so innocent? I mean, I can see sacrificing a bull, or if you know goats at all, I can see sacrificing a goat. Oh, goat lovers are going to hate me now. But a lamb, so innocent, so defenseless, so pure. It's not done anything wrong. And that's deliberate on God's part. It's deliberate on God's part as a reflection of Jesus, who is the sinless Son of God, totally innocent of the sins of mankind, who dies on behalf of mankind. So throughout all the Passover ceremonies, when they were in Egypt and God told them to do this in order to avoid the wrath of God that was going on the region, they said you need to sacrifice this lamb, you need to collect its blood, you need to mark the entry to your house with it, and then you need to consume the entire animal. But it's our little baby. Spotless, had to be pure. So I put the picture there because when you think about slaying an innocent animal like this, something inside of you goes, what caused this? Well, our sin caused this. Their sin caused this. And yet it's the solution to our own sin, is the death of one who's innocent on our behalf. And all through the entire ceremonies that happened at the temple in Israel, that was the consistent theme they were supposed to pick up. Because of your sin, You know, you tell your kids, Mom and Dad, we need to go down to the temple today and sacrifice an ox. Why? Well, because something went wrong and we messed up and we sinned. So by law, we have to go there. And then you would watch the killing of this animal and you'd realize that something innocent has to die on your behalf. Well, in a very important sense, once a year at Passover, your freedom from slavery was paid for by a very innocent creature, Jesus himself. Okay. It was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by... Wait. Stop the bus. It was eaten by the people who returned from exile. Okay, that's all the people. Again, we estimate there's like 40,000 people. The first wave that came back, 40,000 people that came back from Persia. Okay, all the people of Israel who returned from exile, they ate, and also somebody else. I see people looking at their Bibles. This is a mind blower. Now listen to what he says. This is something else. And everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. What? Isn't that illegal? I mean, you're talking all those who joined them and separated themselves from the uncleanness. Well, there's a little speculation about this, but these could be both strangers ethnically to the Jews, as long as they had joined the Jews in a sense. It could be Jews distantly, ethnically, who had intermarried among the pagans in the area, which they should not have done, and it made them unclean as well. And they would be unqualified to take part in the Passover. I mean, it opens out just a fascinating piece of speculation. Who, other than the people who came back from Persia, are taking Passover with them? And isn't that illegal? But look at his qualifications. He says these are people who have separated themselves from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land in order to worship the Lord. So these are people who looked at the pagan worshiping that had been going on in the area and said, we want nothing to do with that. We're putting that away, and we are allying us with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are in on that. Now, can you just make that claim and then suddenly be Jews, being the Passover? Not exactly. So if you go in the Old Testament, you'll find this passage right here, Exodus 12:48. If a stranger shall sojourn with you, that means someone's passing through, and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then he may come near and keep it, and he shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. What? What? A stranger, by the way, means someone who's ethnically not a Jew. You mean like Canaanites? Yes. Well, like Egyptians? Yes. Yeah. In the Ezra passage, it's sojourner. That's someone who's traveling through. They're going from one place to another. They don't even live here. They're clearly not natives. And yet this is one of the most fascinating hints about the new covenant coming down the pipe, because the promise of God's life for us is not just reserved for the Jews. It's reserved for anyone who puts off the junk, the pagan worship, and says, God, I want to be part of what you're about in the community that you're building right here. I want to be in your family and your society and your community. I want you to be my God. Now he stipulates in Exodus there's circumcision that's necessary. That was the mark that you belong to God. But it is a fascinating thing that suddenly here, it seems like the opportunity to live in God's kingdom is being opened up to people who may not even be Jews. At the least of which, maybe Jews who are backslidden and intermarried, which is wrong too. It's a fascinating opening. This is not a statement of purity. This is a statement of hospitality to a people who are in the land. That's a fascinating statement. And you can be part of Passover. Really fascinating. And by the way, Passover is the big celebration. It's the big one. Fascinating. Well, 22. Not only Passover, which is like a one-day event, they kept the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord had made them joyful. Like we weren't a few minutes ago, but that's okay. Well, I'll let you off this time. And so, Passover happens on one day. You sacrifice lambs. There would be hundreds, maybe thousands of lambs that would be sacrificed at the temple when there was a lot of people in Israel. But then that would be followed by 7 days of unleavened bread. Again, mimicking leaving Egypt. You're actually remembering leaving Egypt. The Passover lamb is the one whose blood saved you from the wrath of God that was spread out over everybody including the Jews, but the lamb's blood saved you from that. And then you left Egypt, you left the captivity of Egypt, or symbolically the captivity of sin, and then you left and went somewhere else. Well, they would celebrate going into the desert with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's why it's unleavened bread, because they had to leave fast. There wasn't enough time for yeast to raise it. So that's on the calendar for Jews even to this day. So you celebrate Pesach, which is the Jewish name for Passover, and then for 7 days after that, you eat unraised bread. You eat matzah. Because they left really quick and they couldn't see it raised. But I love this. They kept that Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. With joy, the Lord made them joyful. I mean, can you imagine that in the memory of your parents and your grandparents, this is the first time you have seen a Passover ever, if you were these returnees from Persia? I mean, it would just be thrilling. You'd heard about the temple. You'd heard about Passover. You'd heard about all the 3 festivals you had to go to every year in Jerusalem. You heard about all these wonderful times, and now you finally see it. So they have cause to be joyful. They're just hopping around joyful. They're celebrating not only being freed from Egypt, but now being freed from Persia. It has instant application to their experience. Now it's not just talking about something that had happened, thousands of years before. Now that was just the prototype for what we're experiencing now. God himself sprung us out of Persia with the participation and support of the kings of Persia. Go figure. So it was a great celebration. Great celebration. Wow. Incredible. For the Lord had made them joyful, and he had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them. Go figure. So that the king aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. Yeah. This is a high point in the entire Old Testament. The temple is back. They celebrate the fact that God has sprung them out of captivity, just like it happened in Egypt. He's done it again, and with the participation and support of the kings of Persia. Who would ever figure? And not just one king of Persia, but actually 2 of them. And with the grudging assistance of the guy in the middle. But there you go. That's sufficient cause to celebrate, if nothing else. And that's the end of our story. Because Ezra was all about building the temple. No. Now, it seems like it shouldn't this be the end of the story? I mean, and they all lived happily ever after? I mean, Ezra you're going to free the people. They're going to go back. The king's going to say, build the temple. Today, we got the temple done. We had our big dedication ceremony with all those bulls and goats and stuff like that. And we got all that done. Then we did 1 month later, we did our first Passover. Woo, how exciting is this? And they all lived happily ever after. But no. In fact, we can't finish now. You know why? Well, the book is named Ezra, and he hasn't even shown up in this story yet. He will show up next time. Ezra will show up next time. There's more to come. There's a lot more to come in Ezra and Nehemiah. A lot more to come. But this was the focus of the beginning of the story, the rebuilding of the temple. Now the temple is built. But they didn't live happily ever after. There's still some problems. And so we'll see that come up. And they're fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Okay, so we're just going to do a couple of observations and call it quits. And these are what you've already saw, but I want to draw these out just a little bit. The first thing is the fact that, all the kings that he involved in the process. Cyrus frees the slaves, gives them money, go back and rebuild the temple. That's your job, rebuild the temple. Cyrus, of all people. And then he's followed by Artaxerxes, Ahasuerus. And he's kind of, okay, maybe. Gets some complaints. He's more of a people pleaser. He decides, okay, we'll stop it. He dies. Darius comes up. Right about the same time, the 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, say, no, God says keep going. So they keep going. I wonder about this next guy, Darius. Maybe he'll shut us down just like Artaxerxes did. Well, no, actually. They send word to this guy, and he says, keep doing that. Do what Cyrus said. I mean, it's really an amazing thing. So when we talk about God as being the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, you see it right here. Starting from even Egypt, from Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh was very resistant to freeing God's people, very resistant. It took 10 plagues, and even then he had second thoughts after the 10 plague went down and found his army in the bottom of the Red Sea as a result. But God has his way. That's what's fascinating here. Is he the King of Kings? Well, in these examples, and it'll go on through the rest of the Bible, yes, he is the King of Kings. He is the King of Kings. God gets what he wants. When it comes to his will for the people he loves, he gets what he wants. This is not a foreign phrase of the Old Testament. I mean, you pull this up in the New Testament, and it's mentioned many times, and I'll just mention one of them right here. When Paul wrote to Timothy, who was his up-and-coming pastor in training, 1 Timothy 6:15, as he closes the letter, he talks about God as he who is blessed and the only sovereign, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. The only sovereign, which means, there's only one guy who is the top. That's the sovereign. He's the top. He talks about God as though God is the only sovereign. So he's the King of all the kings. He's the Lord of all the lords. You see this replicated throughout the Bible, that there is one supreme authority, and that's God himself. He's the King of kings. And so, by the way, I bring this up in this election year because he's also the president of all presidents. I mean, he's the only sovereign. He is I love that term. He's the only sovereign. So kings come, kings go. Presidents come, presidents go. We need to, in the interim, be responsible from a loving and a service perspective about who we had influence to put into the positions of power. That's our responsibility. I mean, we need to do that responsibly. But in the end, that sovereign only goes so far. God is our only sovereign. He's in control of all these things. So just putting that in place there. King of Kings, clearly demonstrated. And then you got Passover, Pesach, in this entire thing. Passover, the celebration of God himself taking the initiative to free us from our slavery. And from a New Testament perspective, actually from a biblical perspective, our freeing from the slavery of sin itself. Jesus said, if you sin, you're a slave to sin. And that was our state before Christ. We know what's right and wrong before Christ. I mean, we see in a certain sense a shallow understanding of morality, but there's many things that we agreed upon before Christ that were good or bad to do. We know you're not supposed to steal. We know you're not supposed to lie. We know you're not supposed to do a whole bunch of deceptive things. I mean, we know good and bad sort of in the big picture, but in the end, we seem tragically enslaved to violating it, to sinning. That's in a sense, it's one of the curses of the law itself. The law being a statement of what is righteous action, what reflects the goodness of God. That's what righteousness is. And we can be fully aware of what that is and fully incapable of doing it perfectly. That's the amazing thing about it. Until Christ comes, and then Christ comes, dies on our behalf, and goes through this transformative process where he starts changing our hearts to where we actually decrease in our desire for sin, and he pulls bits of sin out of our life, the habit of sin, one by one. That's called sanctification. Now, he forgives the entire package of our sins. That's justification, and we're accepted by God. But there's still this remnant of this stuff that's woven into our nature, and little by little, he takes it out, and he changes us. Well, Passover is about the fact that God himself is the one who took the issue of our enslavement, self-imposed because of our sin, and freed us based on his price paid on our behalf. That's the beginning of what salvation is all about. So, of course, when you do that, there's great joy in that, and there's a release from that captivity. I've seen so many people who've come to the Lord, when they come to this release from this captivity from sin, they would say, my burden of sin is so tremendous. I mean, how do we get rid of this? I know what I'm supposed to be, but I can't be that way. I've tried. I try to be a good person, and I seem to fail when I let my guard down. I can't do this perfectly. And yet at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, well, you know what? The standard is be ye perfect because your Father in heaven is perfect. How are you going to deal with that? But I can't do that. That's exactly right. But Christ in you does that. He does that. That's a remarkable story about the indwelling of his Spirit in you. Not only are you right with God, your whole package of sins because of what Christ has done on your behalf, but now he's in the process of actively changing you to free you from that sin. So that's kind of a cool thing. So that's joyful. That's joyful. That's joyful. I've seen people who've been released from serious addictions that Christ has done on their behalf when they gave their life to the Lord. And it's like they're saying the burden's gone. Well, when that captivity is lifted, you can sense it. You can just sense it. There's freedom that comes. In fact, the word for salvation is often connected with a word in Greek that is tied to this idea of being freed from a prison, freed from a tight spot to an open place, right? So it's actually being freed from that captivity, like going from a tight little room that someone locked the lock on the outside of it and you can't get out, to where suddenly you're out in an open field and it's like, I'm no longer captive anymore. That's what salvation is to be released from that captivity. And if you read Isaiah 61 that Jesus himself read in his hometown early in his ministry, it says he came to release the captives. From what? Persia? Rome? No. Your own self-imposed sins. That's what you're freed from. Because if you sin, you're a slave to it. Passover, just a wonderful celebration of God's payment on our behalf for the sins that we've done and bringing us to freedom. Here's how Paul puts it, and this is just a wonderful thing. 1 Corinthians 5, he says, regarding things that they were doing wrong, they were acting like idiots, some of them. So he says, look, cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. It's a great connection between the Old Testament sacrifices and Passover itself and the new life in Christ. They are tightly coupled, which is why I pulled those together this morning in communion as well. Tightly coupled. Christ, our Passover lamb, has been slain on our behalf, that the wrath of God may not be visited on us, because the wrath of God is visited on sin. That's what it is. But then he also says there's this process that you do at Passover, and Jews do it to this very day, where just before Passover you go through the house and you clean the house of all bread that's made with yeast. Anything that's got yeast in it, that's what leaven is cleaned out. I've seen this. You go through the house with a fine-tooth feather. That's your dust collector, and you go through the house, and I mean, this is real. This isn't symbolic. They'll go through the house, open every cupboard, see what's in there. If that's where the saltine crackers are, you take the saltine crackers out, and then you go in, and if you had whole grain bread over here, you take that bread out, and then you make sure there's not even a slight iota of that yeast in there, because any that's left behind, if you get it into a piece of flour with water in it, it'll grow. There's lots in there. So what Paul is saying right here is that now that we've come to Christ, now that the Passover lamb has been sacrificed, we're different people. We're different people. In fact, from God's perspective, we're unleavened. There is no leaven of sin. There is no yeast of sin anymore. So why are you acting like there is? Why do you go back to that old behavior? Why do you go back to that old behavior of malice and evil? You're unleavened. So act like it. And now in Christ, we can actually say no to sin and take our little feathers and go, I want this in my life no more. Fascinating. Passover is a great time. Now, the seal that didn't show up in the story, but we're sure happened on that communique that came back from Darius. Seals, this is a very fascinating thing. I mentioned this before. A seal is the recognizable token of an authority's promise or will. Okay? And that seal, although it's not mechanically possible of stopping the action, it is a way of saying, if you go against my word, my entire authority is against you. But on the other side as well, it says, if there's good intended for someone, like with Darius and the people who are building the temple, if there's good involved, like pay for all they need out of the temple, for the temple, out of the treasuries, the Persian treasuries. Those are good. So this is also just a statement of the will of the king, the will of the great authority, not against, but even for somebody. That's what a seal is. I mean, we can see it really clearly in this example with this communication from Darius, as well as so many other places that we see it. By the way, you'll see 7 seals in Revelation. And they're not seals, they're these seals. These seals. What does that mean? That means that what that seal is placed on reflects the authority and the will of the most sovereign, the only sovereign. And so what is inside that seal will happen. It will happen. That's why it's in the seals in Revelation, because it will happen. It will happen. Now, this will blow your mind now that you know what a seal is. Paul says again to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians 1, it's God who establishes us with you in the Messiah and has anointed us, and who has also put his seal on us. He's put his seal on us and given us his Spirit in our hearts as a guarantee. If a seal is the irrevocable authority of the great sovereign, that his will be done, do you realize he's put that seal on you and said, my will for you will be done. No one will stop it. According to who? According to the only sovereign of the universe. And he's put that seal on you. Come on, doesn't that make you want to stand up a little bit? Yeah. That's an incredible thing. So that imagery we lose if we don't see the actual seal that are on documents like from Darius and stuff. God has seen you and said, my will for you will not be changed according to who? According to the only sovereign of the universe. Don't mess with my will for this person. And as a token to go along with that, he gives us his Spirit to kind of say, and here's my down payment. This is the evidence you can see right now for the fact that this is where you're headed, and no one can change that. Who can snatch you away from God's hand? Nobody. Why? Because he's got a seal on me. I like that sound. That's just an amazing thing. That is an amazing thing. Gosh. Okay, you have to see the seals from Darius' perspective to understand that. And then finally, providence. We talked about providence last week in the park. Providence, in a couple ways of saying it, is the unstoppable will of God toward us. It can't be thwarted. It's partially what happens, represented by the seal. It can't be thwarted. And it's a promise from God that is in eternal active fulfillment. That means, in a way, it's not waiting to be fulfilled. It's actively being fulfilled as we speak. This is what providence is all about. And I say that in terms of a kind of an eternal thing that's going on in the background, because we often can't spot it being fulfilled. But God is laying the foundation stones for its ultimate fulfillment, like right now, ahead of time, and you can't even see it happening. And then you get to this thing that happens, you go, whoa, where did that come from? Well, God's been working on this eternally, like from the beginning of the universe. He's got it all figured out. Providence, you cannot thwart his will. And you cannot thwart his will on behalf of the people who has his seal on. It's just the way it is. His will, his love for us, his grace for us cannot be thwarted. I have a book at home. I love the title because the imagery is great. The Sovereignty of Grace. The sovereignty of grace. That is grace itself, what God gives us that we can't earn, that we'll never deserve. It's sovereign. It cannot be thwarted. God's determination for the love of his grace to come to us cannot be stopped. The sovereignty of grace. Let me just show you this, because this is an interesting example of that sovereignty happening. So here's where we're going to do our math. I told you we're going to do a little year math. Here we go. In Ezra 6, we read this morning, this house was finished in the 3rd day of the month of Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of Darius. Now, he's being very specific, the 6th year of the reign of Darius. Now, if you flip over to the book of Daniel, Daniel was a contemporary of all these events going down. He's living over actually in the Medo-Persian area rather than Jerusalem right now. He writes in Daniel 5, verse 31, Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. So when Darius starts ruling, he's 62. So here's your math. How old was Darius when the temple was finished? 62 plus 6. 68. Okay, 68. Whew, that was hard. I know that was hard. Do you know what was going on 68 years before the finishing of the temple? 68 years. 70 years here in captivity. 68 years before that, Nebuchadnezzar had just destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And for the next couple years after that, he was hauling away the captives to Babylonia. So I mention this because it turns out that the very same time that God allowed the Israelites to be hauled into the captivity under Nebuchadnezzar, God caused a little baby to be born in the Medo-Persian area of the world. And this little baby grew up 68 years later to release those same Jews to send them back to Israel. God had already started his plan, his providential plan of grace to return them to the land by bringing to birth a king of the empire. Exactly at the same time they were being hauled away. So in a sense, as they're being hauled away and they're wondering, are we hopeless? Do we have a hope? God says, you can't see it, but this guy Darius just got born this week, and he's going to be instrumental in my hand in terms of you finishing the temple. And so God already laid the foundation for the temple at the birth of Darius, at the very time they were being carried into captivity. That's providence. That's an amazing thing. Let me give you another piece of providence in all this. At this very same time, we mentioned Daniel many times. Daniel was carried away by Nebuchadnezzar, went into Babylonia. Babylonia got taken over by the Assyrians. The Assyrians got being taken over by, the Babylonians, and then they got taken over by the Persians, the Medo-Persians. Well, when Daniel goes in there, Daniel is a gifted guy when it comes to prophecy. And you read Daniel's book, oh my gosh, there's some amazing things in Daniel's book. Daniel 9 is especially interesting, not only because in Daniel 9 he recognized that it would be 70 years of captivity based on what Jeremiah said, but he also realized it had been 70 weeks of years that they haven't tended to the land. And then it'll be another 70 weeks of years until the Messiah comes and finishes his work. I'm like in the halfway point. Daniel realized. Well, Daniel gets carried off into captivity at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's carried into the Medo-Persian area. Now, Daniel knows what's going to happen in the future, and I'm sure before he died, he blabbed to a lot of people in the area about not only what was going to happen in the 70 year of captivity, but the end of the work of the Messiah himself was going to be 70 weeks of years. I'm sure he told everyone there. Well, in the Medo-Persian, in the Mede area, actually, the Medians had 6 tribes. 6 tribes comprised the Mede people. One of those tribes were called Magi, M-A-G-I. Magi were people who were Zoroastrian priests in the Medo religion, and they were guys who predicted the future, who watched the stars, who knew what was going to come up in the future. Kings consulted them. Many times kings were coronated through them. The Magi. Magi. Do you know that word Magi? Because 69 weeks of years later, some Magi showed up from the east, almost certainly from the Medes who lived in the area where Darius was, of the tribe of Magi. And they came and they said, we're looking for the king of Israel. What? Yeah. The providence is the fact that God took Daniel, put him in the Medo area. They propagated the news about the coming of the king of Israel. And then when the king of Israel is actually born in Israel, they show up kind of as a billboard and say, the king of Israel has been born. We're looking for him. Can you tell us what house he's in? In a way, it's God's way 5 centuries before the fact of serving notice to the world, not just to the Jews, but even to the Magi tribe in the Mede-Persian Empire, that something phenomenal was going to happen, and here comes the king. Here comes the king. That's another piece of providence that God lays in place by taking Daniel into captivity in the Medo-Persian Empire. So providence is something that we can always count on, but doggone it, we can never recognize it when it's happening until we look backwards. When you look backwards, you can see things that you couldn't see looking forward. Again, since he has his seal on you, his will for you will not be thwarted. How does he do that? Providence. Even through the use of evil people, like kings of Persia, like whatever, like the evil Midianite traders that took Joseph captive and sold him into Egypt. I mean, through all the bad events in life, God has put his seal on you. And as Paul says so plainly in Romans 8, and all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Providence. Now, I mention that because that's just a remarkable place to be as a believer, especially when it seems like the world's falling apart. Is God still in control? Is the question that always comes back to mind. And because we have such solid evidence and details of providence throughout the Bible, we can say yes. And as Paul says to the Corinthians, God's put his seal on you. So it's good will happen to you from God's perspective. Now, let me give a caveat to that. That doesn't mean life will always be comfortable. Fathers discipline children for their good. So life can be up and down in terms of comfort and stuff. But in the end of life, you can look back at maybe the ups and downs circumstantial in life and say, was God in control? Was God actually in a process that I couldn't see of bringing good to my life? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Even through the hard times, it's the hardest times that the best gold was put in my life. And I can say that. I can just say that because that's true for me as well. So it doesn't guarantee an easy life necessarily, but it does guarantee a good life from God's perspective, what's good for you, which will include times that you don't agree with and times that you do agree with. But God's will for you will never be thwarted. Ever. Ever. That's his intention for you. That's his providence. So anyway, that's just a handful of random ideas you see in this story. And the nation of Israel understood the fact, too, that if they have been released from captivity because of God's initiative, God's influence over the greatest kings on earth at the time, the superpowers at the time, God can do anything. And so their attitude as they came into the nation of Israel, again, was to thank him and celebrate him and be joyful about the fact that we have a God who's bringing good to us. And we can as well. Because, by the way, we're those sojourners, we're those strangers on the road who've been incorporated into the kingdom and who he has blessed with his presence. So, because we have a lot to celebrate, we're going to feast. By the way, if you want to read the best feast chapter in the Bible, you just went to Isaiah 25. Read that today. Oh, every time I read it, I cry. The feast chapter, Isaiah 25. Father in heaven, we thank you that you've called us to yourself. And it's you that have called us. There's nothing we could do to catch your eye or to earn your respect or to promote ourselves. Lord, in our honest and quiet moments, we realize that deep inside us we're tainted. We're tainted in a way that even we don't want to be there. How can you love someone like us? And yet in that condition, kind of as street orphans, dirty faces, no shoes, aimless and without hope, you called us to yourself. You adopted us as children. You adopted us deliberately and brought us to yourself, paid the price for our rebellion and our sin, and not only put your seal on us, but gave us your name, and now you call us your children. That is just an astonishing thing. So much love. It's just amazing. Father, we thank you for this passage. We pray your Spirit would continue to give us insight about the great news of the God who loves and who is the only sovereign in that love. The only sovereign, and nothing can stop or get in the way of the sovereignty of your grace toward us. So thank you for this now in Jesus' name. Amen.